This is the Ronin of Philosophy, where I talk about ideas and cultural effects and events and try to examine them from an objective point of view and address all sides. I want to talk about the idea of American anti-intellectualism. It's something that has been on the rise for the last 30-40 years since the era of George W. Bush. Popularly, anti-intellectualism is considered to be the rejection of scientific analysis and statistics when looking at cultural events or natural events in the world today. It's considered the stubborn continuation of policies and actions that are considered reckless, anti-scientific, and morally and ethically and socially dangerous. It's an attitude that spits at these facts and ideas that are, objectively speaking, trying to help improve things and society at large in favor of a popular worldview that is not factually supported, or at the very least loosely factually supported, and is usually associated with conservative ideals and values within American society. And as I said before, this is something that's been ongoing for the last 30 or 40 years. That being said though, it didn't really become popular or mainstream, I think, until Donald Trump took presidency in 2016. His seeming rejection of environmental issues, social issues regarding Muslims and Latinos, and practically spitting at national world leaders who were trying to get America on board with the environmental and political policies for the good of the larger world, while at the same time embracing and trying to encourage relationships with strongman type leaders across the world who rejected progressive values or ideas of democracy and liberty, or at the very least preferred a much tightly controlled version of it. All this to the dismay of the progressive faction of Americans in the country at that time. Many wondered how Americans could put into office such a president who seemed so, and this is quote their view, racist, misogynistic, and so clueless as to political policies that he would endanger America and potentially the ideas of freedom and democracy in the world at large with his support of such strong-arm tactics, strongmen, and anti-seemingly democratic views of different peoples and diversity and progressive values as well. And this is when the term anti-intellectualism really came into the mainstream within the American mindset, because a lot of people started to term it that. There was even an insider report as of 2019, 3 years ago, that 80% of the population still bought into unscientific ideas. And as COVID was beginning to explode, that many Americans still continued to go outside and do and plan public events without masks. All this in spite of the increasing death toll and the rise of COVID infections. While this came to the glee of many conservatives and many Americans who supported them, it floored and infuriated everyone else at the same time. While many tend to think of anti-intellectualism boiling down to just willful ignorance and denial of scientific facts, it's a lot more complicated than that, a lot more nuanced. I would say that the philosophy itself goes back to the foundations of the United States in its origins. Overall, America has always prided itself on its ruggedness and independence more than its intellect and expertise in specific areas, even though those two clearly existed. For the first 100 or 200 years, the idea of an American wasn't an intellectual man coming out of a college or university, but rather a frontiersman or a cowboy, or someone who was roughing it on the edge of society and nature, trying to survive and fighting off locals in order to run their homesteads and families. When European colonists started arriving in America around the 15th century, they were fleeing many of the political and religious social infrastructures that they had left behind and that they considered corrupt or no longer safe to be in. While many of these colonists still held a loyalty to the kings and queens of those countries that they were fleeing, they were now a half world away, and their systems now had less control over them as well. But perhaps more importantly was that they were abandoning the upper class hierarchy that stifled much of the political, ethical, and religious values that they wanted to practice. Keep in mind that Europe at this time was a bunch of kingdoms, countries, and empires vying for control, and had become much more tightly organized and structured in this game of global chess. There was little room for differing practices or ingenuity or diversity. It was a zero sum between different powers, each of them trying to gain control and make sure that their sum was the top one. These political intrigues required the allegiance of citizens under them, whether they liked it or not, so as to buffer themselves from external threats, such as the Turkish Empire and other competing powers that were existing at that time. They were dependent on their centuries-old structures, such as the rule of kings and nobility, to maintain and hold that line, while at the same time trying to expand their influence across the known European continent as well as the world. Therefore, those who were at the top of this hierarchy, kings and elites and such, were often out of touch with the sufferings of the common people and that their choices had upon them. So while the people fleeing this were not stupid or just dumb, they at the same time didn't have access to higher education such as universities and books and whatnot beyond perhaps the Bible. The idea of special treatment based on inheritance or class separation or anything along those lines, they left behind in Europe. And now everything was supposed to be more egalitarian. Now, all that being said, it must be noted that America's first leaders during around the time of the Revolution and definitely after were indeed very well educated, such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. However, around their fellow Americans, they were not flaunted as such, save for the fact that they had houses, some of them could travel the world, and half of them owned slaves. Yet, despite these trappings of wealth and seemingly old-style intellectualism that they still maintained, they still earned it. It wasn't something that was inherited from their fathers or their grandfathers or anything along those lines. And they certainly weren't kings of any kind. Therefore, many Americans tended to excuse them as elites and whatnot. Also, too, many of these leaders had fought in the American Revolution, this leading to the idea of veterans being more authentic and more rugged and more practical rather than some sort of stuffy intellectual or some high king or queen who was ruling from afar. Since then, this idea of earning your keep, earning your happiness, and earning your way in success has remained within American society today, and it contributes to the idea of independence and hostility towards anything that begins to reek of charity or giving away money or power or anything along those lines. While there has been an intellectual and class separation since then as well, the main idea that many Americans still see themselves as is that rugged independence and self-worth and self-value that they created themselves, not something that they got from somebody else. This is from the homes we live in, to the property that we own, and to the cars that we drive, to the lifestyles that we live. All these things reek of self-created, self-motivated, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, but self-centered point of view in terms of their individualism and how they choose to live. Therefore, it's not uncommon that many people from outside America tend to view it as kind of a backwater country that was borderline uncivilized, and while it had its value, at the same time, it did not hold the same rank and peer with longer standing empires such as France or England or even Portugal and Spain. But this was something that many Americans also didn't really care about, as they were trying to expand their frontiers westward and got into more conflicts with Native Americans and Mexicans. So too did the idea that Americans were not puffed up noblemen or well-dressed, well-mannered spokesmen, that they were hard-working, hard-fighting people that earned their keep, and that their individualism and their value was in that, not in how civilized or how clean that they looked. Now, as I stated before, as the country grew older, a hierarchy did eventually start to take place, but this original attitude was still something that Americans clung to, especially since the foundations of these hierarchies, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the Fords, these were still people who earned that. It was something that they built from the ground up. Again, not something that was imported or inherited, but that was created by themselves, and that they just happened to turn into economic empires and higher social status. This is where the idea of anti-intellectualism really starts to kind of take hold. That Americans during this time preferred philosophies and religious beliefs that can translate into action rather than into a small group of people who sat in their pompous asses trying to maintain control, or spat out ideas that didn't help them to farm better or hunt better or build up their families. I think perhaps the best example of this conflict was with the issue of slavery, and specifically the philosophy of abolitionism. Abolitionism basically supported the idea that no African slaves should be born to be slaves, but that rather that they were free men and women who should have the right to live their lives as they saw fit. However, the American South was the extreme opposite of that, where they believed, by their religious piety and their own humble origins, that Africans, being racially and culturally just different from everything they ever known, deserved to be slaves from the time that they were born to the time that they died, because they were just better at working fields and also were just seen as basically being inferior. And what eventually happened was that many Southerners grew to regard the North with the same suspicion and distrust that both the North and the South had of Europe. People from on high using their intelligence and power to rule over their own individuality and choices. All this, of course, while ignoring blacks and Native Americans whose own humanity was being ignored from the very beginning. This only increased after the American Civil War, as the South was now turned into a war-torn landscape with its society and economy shattered, and the backbones of that system now legally freed people, while the distant North continued to prosper unabated and largely untouched by the war. On other fronts, though, increasing scientific knowledge was readily accepted, as long as it was practical and could be applied to everyday situations. Therefore, medicine and technology to develop the land and kill other humans easily fell into this trope. Few cared or knew about the blossoming ideas that were going on in Europe. However, that all began to change with the theory of evolution from Charles Darwin in 1859, and that became an entirely different story altogether. Not only was evolution pretty useless to American farmers and frontiersmen, but it was also heretical to one of the founding pillars of American identity, that of religion. And this was even if many of these Americans weren't exactly the most religious people in the world, or perhaps maybe even closet atheists. Say what you want about religion, but the one thing that it has always had over science is the certainty and comfort it provides a person and society's existence. A sense of forward-facing purpose rather than just existing for existence sake, and shit just randomly happens to you for no reason at all. Yet, despite this aspect of comfort, even religion didn't escape the rise of intellectualism for long, as the development of archaeology overseas began to force a question more and more of the historical roots of early Christianity. This was often referred to as the historical Jesus. And more theologians were becoming versed in these educational-focused ideas that were less spiritual in their approach to the faith. Because of this led many regular Christians in America, and church leaders as well, to reject it, as demystify their faith, as well as being less personal and more systematic and scientific. Moreover, this era also saw the splitting up of Christianity within America into multiple denominations, as well as a growing prominence to rely on supernatural aspects of the faith that were written in the Bible but were rarely seen or ever talked about. Being scientific was seen as a threat to that, as it lacked blind faith in God. Even without the supernatural, this suspicion towards theology still exists, despite its growing prominence. This is something that I had seen while in college, that many Christians and regular pastors and whatnot regarded theologians who had spent years studying different aspects of faith and other religions and the Bible as arrogant elites who looked down upon them for not being as quote-unquote smart or as educated as they are. It's an idea that still persists to this day. Another area where intellectualism began to prosper in American society was in the Industrial Revolution. The era forced the development of progressive child labor laws and the first unions to treat factory workers as human beings instead of fleshly and expendable machines. It saw railroads changing the nature of travel that also changed the nature of communication between people. And it also saw the first creation of a national refuge for nature in Yellowstone National Park. Anti-intellectualism really begins to morph into its modern incarnation as the wealth grab starts to grow across the country. Urban centers like New York and Philadelphia grew richer from the rise of industry, their own legacies of the people who created it and their descendants, and becoming centers of commerce. These developments were largely focused in the East, while the more far-flung areas like the South and the West became more defined by their continuing efforts to establish themselves in these new areas of the continent through, again, ruggedness and survival. Even as they began to grow their own urban centers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the East Coast still had a head start over them, with the exceptions of Los Angeles and San Francisco. Being unhindered since the American Revolution, I believe that this allowed the East Coast to become fertile ground for more higher scientific ideas and philosophies to establish themselves, and thus this is where the divide starts to begin. That is my overview of the origins of American anti-intellectualism, with the latter developments starting to bleed into today's incarnation. But there is another side to this argument though. A counter put forth that progressives, for all their posturing and the champions of science and expertise, are also just as anti-intellectual as their opponents. There is a view that progressives, while seemingly smart and educated, tend to be not that familiar with the nuances and the details of the ideas that they are putting forth. A lack of other points of view, or economics or policy issues, things of that sort, things that become second place to their passion about the issues that they tend to represent. Essentially, all ideas and no plan, which again is the primary American problem with intellectuals. During the 2020 elections, I remember asking my cousin about why the divide in Louisiana still exists, since there's a large population of Black Americans there, and yet it's still considered a red state. My cousin happened to be a doctor who lives in New Orleans and was more well-versed on this than I was. What he pointed out to me was that it was regarding Biden's promise to close the oil rigs offshore, which was a major source of employment for both blacks and whites in the state. But at the same time, Biden was offering no plan to replace them. I have also seen other examples while taking part in the Black Lives Matter movement. While the outrage over police brutality was just and worth taking to the streets for, there also seemed to be no plan to be put in place to replace it, with the exception of ideas like defund the police. Individually, I asked many members and leaders what their thoughts were on it and if they had ideas, and they did. But by and large, for the movement as a whole, they didn't really see anything in place. This refusal to question and examine one's own beliefs and actions and provide adequate detail about the alternatives that they are protesting over, or dismiss talking to people over those actions and how it would affect them, is claimed to be the same blind ignorance and acceptance that is attributed to the conservatives when it comes to being anti-intellectual. Yet the interesting thing about this comparison is that Americans have always been aware of these differences in one way or another, and seemingly have seemed to proudly flaunt it. As comedian Chris Rock pointed out in his 1996 comedy show Bring the Pain, a black man who got out of prison got more respect on the street than a black man who struggled and got a master's degree. Essentially, that if it didn't help you survive in the streets, then no one gave a fuck. Farmers in the Midwest were not concerned about COVID because it didn't affect their own communities or crops. Meanwhile, social justice warriors who fought their battles online seemed to just copy and paste tactics of using buzzwords for common issues that everyone already knew about, without doing any actual research or actual footwork into why those people held those positions or what they were planning to do to replace it. He's included ideas such as mansplaining, white privilege, and okay boom. When I traveled in France and Morocco, my lack of knowledge regarding the metric system earned the ire of some people I met or had traveled with there who were from other countries, as being proudly ignorant of how the rest of the world worked. Outside of America, there are stereotypes of American tourists just being rude and uncouth that they grouped me in as being an American. While this was untrue that I was uneducated and just an ignorant American, just the fact that the category existed to put me in the first place says a lot about how they saw Americans overall. And this idea seems to have gotten to the point that during the last election, many African journalists were comparing our election to the elections of the most worst off African countries. So therefore, it seemed that many of them viewed Americans as either elitists or anti-intellectuals or some mix of the two. And any American who did not behave by that stereotype tended to confound them, at least in my experience. So given these elements and facts, anti-intellectualism is a real phenomenon in America, but it's not a new one. Rather, it's one that all Americans have inherited and manifest differently depending on the person, region, and value. If anything, it isn't as much of a rejection of expertise in science, but a contentment in knowing what you know and giving the finger to anyone who judges you for it or tries to contradict or change your mind. On the other hand, intellectualism as a counter is the person having a belief or bias, but also has thought it out to the point where they are open to research and criticism. It has emotion, but at the same time, it is not controlled by them so as not to overreact. And this is the way an intellectual should be.